Okay, so welcome to the November monthly meeting of the Miami Pioneers and Natives of Dade. And today we have John Nordt, who's going to talk about Coconut Grove, Biscayne Bay history, and the lighthouse, and a few other wonderful subjects. Islandia, I know we're in for a wonderful presentation. So let's give a hand to John. Thank you for joining us, John.
Thanks for having me. Well, I first gave this talk about 22 years ago, and I'll give you some history about it as we get into it. It's about Coconut Grove, Biscayne Bay, the history of Elliott Key and Coconut Grove. And we're going to start off with a gentleman who was inspirational to me, who I've known from the 60s until he passed away. And that person is I can't change my thing here.
Oh, so hitting spacebar doesn't change it, huh?
Spacebar. That's a spacebar. Then you're gonna select that spacebar.
Oh, you're gonna have to wait on me now. I don't know.
Yeah, hit the red thing and get rid of that.
I can't without doing this.
There.
There we go.
Yes.
Got it.
This gentleman is Lancelot Garfield Jones. And I'll give you a lot of history on him, but his middle name Garfield, I think President Garfield was assassinated the same year he was born. And his brother was named King Arthur, and his name was Sir Lancelot. And Mary Davis, who owned the land with her husband on the southern tip of Key Biscayne, which I'll get to in a minute, his mother asked for names of her two boys, and Mary Davis loved Camelot, so therefore named Sir Lancelot and King Arthur. So the next slide here, back up a minute, is A.D. Bache's survey map of Key Biscayne. And this is 1850, and it shows Key Biscayne before much else had happened. On the north end is where the Key Biscayne Marina is. On the southern end is the Cape Florida and the Cape Florida Lighthouse, which was built in 1825. Now,
a lot of mangroves on the west side there, right?
A lot everywhere.
Those are gone.
Now, this is the southern tip of Key Biscayne, and it's a very busy map, and I'm going to show you, we're going to get into some details about it in about 2 seconds here. You can see the circle on the right-hand side. That's the lighthouse to give you a bearing of what's going on. Now, this is on the lower left, and it says south end of Key Biscayne, Florida, Cape Florida, with a lighthouse reservation, from a survey made March 10 to 12, 1898, by a Lieutenant Colonel A.N. Damrell of the Lighthouse Engineers, 7th and 8th Districts. Now, March 10th and 12th of 1898, what happened the year before? The Maine blew up in Havana Harbor. So the federal government had to have established all 136 lighthouse stations around the southeastern United States with wind signal displayment to be able to communicate with ships at sea, obviously since there was no radios. And so this was a survey of this particular lighthouse station. They were all up and down the East Coast and into New Orleans. So this is a southeastern tip of Key Biscayne, and I'm going to hone down one more time. And you can see the lighthouse, the old tower, which was built in 1825. You can see the keeper's cottage and the cistern, the latitude and longitude, and this was about 4 feet above mean high water. Now, I want to mention a little history here. This was built in 1825. The first Seminole War ended in 1819, and the second Seminole War didn't start till 1835. And so between 1820, 21, and 22, there were many Black Seminoles or escaped slaves coming into northern Florida because at that time it was a Spanish territory. They came south and formed a town south of Bradenton called New Angola. So these are Black Seminoles that escaped, and they had their own livestock and their crops, and they're just south of Bradenton, Florida. Well, the military came in 1821, 1823, try to recover these, quote, slaves, which at the time, you could say that's my slave. You didn't have to have any documentation, and you could take them back to your plantation. So anyway, they escaped. They came down through Cape Sable. They came across Biscayne Bay to Cape Florida, and on dugout canoes with sails, sailed across to the northern end of Andros Island to a town called Red Bay. And Red Bay still today, 200 years later, has cheeky huts with thatched roofs and reed baskets, and a lot of Seminole culture is still there. At 1823, British basically outlawed slavery, so they knew they were safe. So the next slide shows what was there, and it says, over the entrance to the door to the old brick tower, there's a signboard has been fastened with the following notice in raised letters. Thereon, persons defacing or removing any of the material, iron, and fruit from these premises will be prosecuted by the Biscayne Bay Yacht Club. The Biscayne Bay Yacht Club was founded in 1887. This is the first station. The lintel of the door is painted with a 6-inch high letters BBYC. And as I'm continuing reading, since the lease of the entire premises of Cape Florida, the Lighthouse Reservation, to the Biscayne Bay Yacht Club expired in 1896, 9 years later, Mr. Waters Davis has been appointed sole custodian for the Lighthouse property to the Honorable Secretary of the Treasury. The Lighthouse Reservation now embraces several acres of land belonging to Mrs. Harney, widow of the late General W.S. Harney, and taxes have been paid since 1872. Now, William Harney was the one who led the fight for the Second Seminole War. He's the one that went into the Everglades and hung Chiquita, who killed Dr. Henry Perrine at Indian Key, and that's a whole nother story. At the bottom, you see that they even go through and they talk about what's there. There are mulberries, plums, pears, royal palms, rubber trees, and oranges. And it's a very interesting overview, like an aerial photograph of what existed at that time. Now, the next picture is a picture taken by Commodore Ralph Monroe. This is Israel Lafayette Jones, or commonly known as Parson Jones, or the philosopher of Caesar's Creek. This was taken about 1895, 1900. He was born in the 1850s, the son of slaves. He lived in Raleigh, North Carolina, and at an early age moved to Wilmington, North Carolina, where he learned how to sail small boats. He didn't want to stay in Wilmington, so he came to Orlando to grow citrus and orange groves. The freeze of 1895 drove him further to Miami, and he applied for a job with Commodore Ralph Monroe. Now, Lancelot, his son, who we'll talk about in a minute, told me that Parson Jones was asked by the Commodore, how can you sail a boat? You grew up inland. And he said he promptly got in a little sailboat, sailed out around and showed he could do it. So he was hired as the lighthouse keeper, wind signal displayman on the southern tip of Key Biscayne. He also, interestingly, met a lovely lady who was the chief cook at the Peacock Inn, or Bayview House in Coconut Grove. And Moselle Albury was from Harbor Island. She moved to Key West and then came up to be the chief cook at the Peacock Inn, and that's where they met. They ended up having 2 children, and that story goes on in a minute. So here is a dwelling for Israel Lafayette Jones in that same survey map. And you can see a chicken yard, a privy, and a dwelling for Israel Lafayette Jones, gardener and planter in the employ of Mr. Waters Davis, and wind signal displayman, May 22, 1897, appointed by A.J. Mitchell. And I want to point out that wharf is very important in a few minutes. The signboard reads, "No trespassing, hunting, or shooting." Now, King Arthur was born the year before, was older, obviously, and Lancelot was younger, born October 2, 1898. And his mother was in labor in this dwelling. And knowing the baby was going to come, she had her sister, who was a midwife, come from Nassau, one of 4 sisters. And she was there all night. And I'm going to let you listen to Lancelot Jones tell the story himself on a video I did in January of 1990. I've got about a 40-minute video of him. This is a small snippet.
Johnny said you were born on Key Biscayne. I said, no, I wasn't. John Nordt said you were born on Key Biscayne, and I said, no, you were not born on Key Biscayne.
Well,
You're supposed to be born in Miami. You tried to get born in Key Biscayne. You weren't born either place, were you?
no, it's a strange, very strange and unusual thing. My father was a procrastinator in a measure, but she was more of a procrastinator. So she had her sister. One of her sisters, she had four sisters. She had one come over and be a nurse during this state of pregnancy. So he had in those days, that's all they had was a sailboat. And she had, like today, she had kind of a creeping pains, the little pains, but they just discounted. It says nothing, it isn't time yet. You have a few more days. You have a few more days before anything really happens. So that night, these pains grew worse, stronger. So he said, well, by daylight, he put her and the midwife, sister, on the boat. So now we got to go over to Dr. Jackson. Jackson was the doctor,
Henry Jackson.
Huh?
Henry Jackson.
Yeah, the Jackson Memorial Hospital
Yeah.
named after.
He delivered me. He delivered me.
Well, he got the boat all ready, and they started over, and was almost calm. So when they got about a mile off, away from the point,
Southwest Point.
where your dad had his house,
Master.
yeah, I arrived there on the boat.
You decided you weren't going to procrastinate.
No, I arrived on the boat, and of course, this midwife, she knew how to clip the string,
Tie off the umbilical cord.
Yeah. And by the time we got over, to put me in the hands of Dr. Jackson, everything was all right. He didn't have much to do. He just spanked me and so forth. And there it was.
So that was taken in an interview on board Hardy Matheson's boat on Caesars Creek in January 1990. Hardy Matheson was his attorney during the change of land and the park buying property. And Hardy was the only one he listened to, and he knew me. And that was I don't think any other video has been done of him. But you can tell a Bahamian accent and everything else. It's absolutely delightful. And that he arrived is amazing. This next map is an India ink on linen map I acquired about 30 years ago from about 1900. And a friend of mine had it in a bunch of papers. And if you blow it up, on the right-hand side, you can see Dinner Key. It might be obscured, it is with me, but you can see the tidal flats behind it actually showing Dinner Key as a key. And if you recall, Dinner Key was a stopping place for small boats sailing from Cutler north to Miami River. And they'd stop and have supper or dinner midday and sail on to the Miami River. Around where it says Coconut Grove, there's a wharf coming out. It says store and post office. That wharf is the wharf that they came to when he was born, after he was born. You see the mention of a hotel there. That's the Bayview House or the Peacock Inn. Just north of there it says Monroe, and he's the one that donated the land for the Housekeepers Club and the Union Chapel. And just north of there is W.D. Albury, who was the justice of the peace for Coconut Grove, which that'll come into play a little bit later. And north of there is Richard Carney. Now, Richard Carney came down from New Jersey with the Osborne brothers to plant coconuts on Miami Beach in the early 1870s, and all the rabbits ate the shoots. So the Osbornes went north and Carney stayed. I'm going to tell you another story about Carney in just a minute. To the left, though, is the Peacock Inn. And as we go down, a main highway wasn't there because that was after 1896. So this is the Bayview House or the Peacock Inn. And there's many photographs of this, but this shows everybody in their finery, probably around Christmas time. There's a little boy in front with a sailboat model. All the little girls are dressed up in their dresses. And it was a first hotel south of Palm Beach at that time. And many of the people that came down here really enjoyed the formality in a very frontier place. So this is sort of a cartoon rendering of where the Peacock Inn was. On the right-hand side is McFarland Road. The 19 is the Bayview House or Peacock Inn. And then we go to the next one on the other side of McFarland. This is the South Bay Shore Drive or the Miami Road. The 9 is the Peacock General Store. Number 8 is the Housekeepers Club, which is the first of the 2 Housekeepers Club. Number 10 is Eva Monroe's grave. And if you recall, Commodore Ralph Monroe came down from Staten Island because his wife was sick with tuberculosis and she passed away, and she was buried here, and that grave still exists outside the Peacock Garden Cafe. Number 11 is the Union Chapel. That was basically the pastor was George Merrick's father, Solomon Merrick, and they split it up to black and white, and the Macedonia Baptist Church, Macedonia Church in West Grove is split off with the Plymouth Church. To the next is W.D. Albury, which I mentioned, and then there's Richard Carney's to the side. And there's a quick story about Richard Carney that's interesting. Richard Carney was a prankster, and during Christmas, when all the boats came up from Cutler to celebrate Christmas at the Housekeepers Club, he went in the back bedroom and changed all the outer clothes of all the children. So everybody took different children home that night. That story emanated from Kirk Monroe to the author of the Virginian, Norman Wister, and that's where the story was published. But the true story is Coconut Grove. Anyway, on to the next one. So this is a birth certificate for Lancelot Jones, Lancelot Garfield Jones, October 2, 1898. It's dated 1874, and his mother and father are listed, Israel Lafayette Jones, North Carolina, and Moselle Albury, Harbor Island. And this was to set up some financial things because the Park Service bought most all of his land when the park was created in 1972. So this is an idea of how rough existence was. That's Parson Jones, that's Moselle, and the 2 boys. There's chickens in front, there's pineapples in his hands and bananas, and this is where they lived. At the same time, he was looking for a better place to go. And about 1901, 1902, he purchased land on Caesars Creek on Porgy Key from W.D. Albury, who owned it. So we have a map here, a chart showing the southern end of Elliott Key. You can see Christmas Point, Adams Key, and if you look below Christmas Point, I don't have a pointer, it says W.D. Albury, 1896, and he sold the land to Parson Jones. This is Caesars Creek that still exists today. We're going to talk about Adams Key a little bit further down the road. Now, the next one is a more contemporary nautical chart of the area. Elliott Key, you can see at the top, the little black dot up there is the house that we owned. This is about 1965 or 1970. Adams Key is there. Porgy Key is there, and you can't really see the dock, and then Totten Key is there. Now, I want to talk about Totten Key was owned by Frank Budge, hardware fame, and he was just trying to grow grapefruit, and the 1906 hurricane wiped him out, so he sold the land to Parson Jones, who basically grew key limes and pineapples on it. Back about 1850, 1855, the Army Survey Corps of Engineers, headed by General Joseph Totten, were surveying this area, and his young lieutenant named it for him, and that young lieutenant was Lieutenant Robert E. Lee. So there's a lot of connection with history in this place. So this is the house that was built in 1912 on Porgy Key. You'll see some pictures in a bit, but you can see Moselle Albury. The little girl in front is Sarah Woods. Uncle Albert's at the top left, and Parson Jones is there with the beard. And I'm not sure which son that is there. I know Lancelot denied that was him. The little girl in front is Sarah Woods, who I had a chance to interview before she passed away quite a while ago. And her father was the chauffeur for James Allison, who was the co-developer of Miami Beach with, Jesus, I'm blocking on his name.
Carl Fisher.
Carl Fisher. And so James Allison didn't live very long. He got sick and he passed away. And so all of his furniture and his rugs and everything were given to the chauffeur. And they sold those properties and put together a restaurant on Northwest 50th Street called Mac's Place. Sarah Wood remembers working there, and both the Jones boys would come up. And that's another story, because she became pregnant, divorced, and Lancelot asked to be her godfather. And I'll take that story on in just a little further. So this is a great shot of Parson Jones taken by Commodore Ralph Monroe. This picture was given to me by Charlie Monroe, the grandson of the Commodore, about 25 years ago. And I have an original photograph of this. And the character and delightfulness of this man is amazing. He even went to New York once, and Worth Monroe, the Commodore's son, asked, well, Parson, how'd you like New York? And he said, I think the Parson belongs right down here on Caesar's Creek. He didn't like it very much. So what we are discussing here is wrecking was the income for goods and services for the people that lived in the Florida Keys, including Elliott Key. There were no homes on Elliott Key until after the Civil War. And the wrecking was the chief source of income. And as you're familiar with that, a wreck would go ashore. One had a wreck master, and people would share in the goods and services and whatever they could sell. They had a wine wreck, they had a mechanical wreck, they had a lot of different wrecks. And it was very dangerous business. About 1870, Captain Ben Baker went down to Cuba and brought a bunch of pineapples back, and they found that these pineapples grew very well in the arid solution holes on Plantation Key, which is why it's called Plantation Key, as well as up around Delray Beach and Elliott Key. And so what happens is they found it's a better cash crop than wrecking, and a lot safer. It took 18 months for the bromeliad to grow, and it was a lot of fun and interesting. There were 17 homes on Elliott Key, and I'll show that to you in a minute. This article was written in Harper's Weekly in 1895 by Kirk Monroe, who was a co-founder of the Biscayne Bay Yacht Club. And Kirk Monroe was also a writer of many boys' books, about 22 books he wrote about, like the Hardy Boys in a way. And he also was married to Mary Barr Monroe. And Mary Barr Monroe was a very outspoken activist, and she's the one that went out and plucked the egret plumes off of women's hats because she hated people killing the rookeries, and getting rid of all the birds. So she was an activist. But Kirk Monroe wrote this article, and it's in Harper's Weekly, 1895, and it goes into detail about harvesting pineapples on Elliott Key. I'm fortunate, I bought a copy of this, an original, about 25 years ago. It's pretty precious to me. So if you go a little further, they have the cutters and the toters, and the cutters would take the pineapple, they'd slice it off. They had a smudge pot. The mosquitoes were horrible. You could see the mosquito netting, and they would harvest these, and they would take them and butch them up about 200 to 300 pounds per bushel in a palmetto basket that the toters, these big guys, would take down to schooners, some of which were built on Elliott Key, and they shipped them off to New Orleans or New York, and about a 50% attrition, but they made good money on it. And after the harvest was in June, they all left for the summer because it was hurricane season. And there's an interesting mnemonic that the pioneers had for hurricane season. And basically it was June too soon, July stand by, September, August you must, September remember, and October all over. And this is how they remember. We've extended it into November, but it's a very cute little saying. They had these ships, and they would send north So we went from the wrecking industry to agricultural industry on Elliott Key, Plantation Key, and up along Delray Beach. This is my attempts at growing pineapples in my backyard. I still have some growing. It's just amusing to have them there. It's amazing they do it. They require almost nothing except occasional watering and no fertilizer. You can cut the top off and just stick it back in and it'll grow. Now, there's a lady from Kensington, Maryland, Peg Nemec, who came down about 25 years ago, who was a relative of the Sweeting family. And she put together this map, which I thought was wonderful, and I helped her with what I knew. If you look at the left-hand side, it says University Dock, and anybody that's been down there knows where the bayside of Elliott Key is. And you shoot straight across to the right, to the ocean side, it says Tannehill Piers. And Hall and Virginia Tannehill were very good friends of mine, and I'll show you a picture of their house in a little bit. But they had 17 homes on Elliott Key from about 1875, 1880 until about 1906, when the 1906 hurricane came across, which devastated things.
And those homes are on the ocean side?
Those are on the ocean side with cisterns, and each one, little squares were cisterns. But there's George and Mary Sweeting. I'll show you their house in a minute. There's a Seaside School and Church, which was number 8. And I've walked over the ruins of that when I was a kid. And one of the school children in that school was Abner Sweeting, who when I was 16, he was in his 80s. And he showed us where the schoolhouse was. And he was one of the kids in that school. That school was so important that the Dade County had a school district down there with a school teacher. That was in 1895. And I have a list on another slide, all the children that were in that school. It's a fascinating story of the agricultural part of Elliott Key. It wasn't the pristine forest the Park Service would like you to believe. They have gone since and dynamited most of the cisterns to try to return it to a natural state. They have Little Beach and Big Beach there. And I'm going to go on now. So this is Mr. and Mrs. Sweeting taken in front of their house right after the 1906 hurricane. You can see the house is swayed a little bit. It has a bunch of timbers holding it up. And this is Peg Nemec photograph that she gave to me with a number of others. And she said that they always talked about periwinkles growing around the house when they were living there. She went down there in the late 1980s, and she found periwinkles growing around where the house was. It's an amazing story. So we go on. So Lancelot and his brother Arthur both lived on Porgy Key. Their father died in 1933. Their mother died in 1925. And according to Sarah Woods, Parson Jones worked Moselle to death, and she died at age 56, probably overworked, according to Sarah Woods. But he'd be out, their recreation as kids, because he was a tough taskmaster. As a kid, he would go and they would, for recreationally, go fishing with drop lines, and they would catch bonefish. They knew the tides, the light, and the bait, and they were quite good at that, and that was their recreation. He also would take his boat down the west side of Biscayne Bay and go all the way up to the Miami River. This is the old Miami River, the old Brickell Avenue Bridge doesn't exist anymore. And he'd go up to the Tommy's Boatyard, which doesn't exist anymore, and is a condominium. And he'd take this 16-foot skiff and the engines. He'd store the engines safely, turn the boat upside down, and he'd go visit his girlfriend, Sarah Woods. And I mentioned Sarah had gotten married to some man, a musician in Nassau. She became pregnant, but the marriage failed, and she came back to the restaurant before she had the baby. And that's when Lancelot asked if he could be the godfather of her child. And she always, they called them the Lime Kings because they basically brought up food and all kinds of fish and mangoes and grapefruit and key limes to the restaurant. So when he came up to visit her to the house he built for her on Northwest 50th, that's when I met her, and I saw him in his last year or two. And afterwards, he'd head on back to the house that his father built in 1912. And this is the house, very Bahamian style, looking across the bay at it. You get a little closer. He tied his boat up at a ramshackle dock. And there was a porch in front, 2 stories, 2 bedrooms upstairs, 4 downstairs, and a kitchen with a cistern underneath it. And he was very proud because he said the only hurricane that brought water up to the 2nd step was Hurricane Betsy in 1965. And so it was a very safe house for his consideration. So on the 2nd story, he had just finished repainting the house and cleaning it up. And across the way here is a catamaran with a houseboat that belonged to a fellow named Keith Barnes. And Keith now lives in Pine Island, but Keith is the one that helped him with his chores, because at this point in time, Lancelot's in his late 80s. So we go on, it's a very good shot of the house with the date palms and the clerestory up top where I took the picture. And there's a kitchen off to the left. And they had about 80 acres in the back, for which they harvested key limes. And key lime juice was big in the drugstores in the 1930s. And Lancelot told me it worked pretty well until Coca-Cola came into being about 1939, 1940, just before World War II. So that's a long time ago, but I used to visit with Lancelot, and he used to give his sponge talks. My dad, who was an airline pilot, we used to go visit him. We knew him when we had our house in Elliott Key, which I'll finish up the talk with. So he would give his sponge talks. He was amazingly bright, well-educated. He had a college education. He would discuss the grass sponges, the wool sponges, and the yellow sponges. The wool sponges they harvested, you can see the little holes in the sponge called oscules. And those oscules, basically, they were filter feeders, and they pushed the water up. And he could see a boil in shallow water where the sponge was, and harvested them. And he brought them back, excuse me. He brought them back and let the animal matter die, and they'd put them in the creek for 2 weeks in a mesh bag, and they'd clean themselves up, and then he'd give them away. And it was just an amazing thing. I have a few of them still here. There's another shot of him sitting on his front porch. On his front porch, he gave sponge talks to everybody. He talked about fishing, and he was just a wealth of information for South Biscayne Bay and the history. He knew Commodore Ralph Monroe, he knew Carl Fisher, and he knew all these individuals because he was born in 1898. Anyway, as you notice, he's sitting on a bent woods deck chair. And I asked him where the deck chair came from. He said, well, about early 1930s, a cruise ship went aground on Triumph Reef offshore, and she careened over. 6 deck chairs slid off. They got her off and sailed her on. Well, they kept the 6 deck chairs. He said they wore the other 4 out. They just had 2 left. So this is a de Brahms map of the southeastern tip of Florida. And you can see where it says Sandwich Gulf. And the Kester's at the top. This is about 1760, 1770. And the English period was 1763 to 1783, when the English owned Florida. And instead of Biscayne Bay, it was called Sandwich Gulf for the Earl of Sandwich, and named by the explorers at the time, and de Brahms picked it up. Now, Sandwich Gulf was very interesting, and that fits into some of the information I'll give you in a minute. So Lancelot would come back down, and he would be with his brother. His brother died in 1966. This was taken about 1982 or 83. And he would guide many of the notables that came to the Cocoloba K Club. He would love to get a newspaper. He loved ice cream, didn't really drink much, but he had a great time with visitors. And I just can't imagine the number of people that met him that I'll never know about. I've often thought about putting a note in Field and Stream asking if anybody remembers. It'd be interesting to harvest those stories. At any rate, July of 82, I was in my office practicing, and he called me and said he had an accident. And it was sad, but he burned his house down. And what happened is, as per usual, they had a propane gas tank to run the refrigerator and the stove, and then hook up the new gas line. And in order to check for a leak, he'd put a match to it. A little leak would flame, and he'd take a quarter turn, and it was gone. Well, the leak was too big, and it caught the eaves on fire, and the whole place burned down. And Keith Barnes was there at the time. I was down there. This is about 4 days after it happened. I got down there that weekend. Most of the stuff had burned. Most of the rubble had been cleared. The top floor, of course, was all wood, so that's gone. So the sable palms, as you can see, were there, and you can see how hot the fire was by the burned trees on both sides. If I can get this to go again. So this is the front steps, and this is on the right side, the 3 columns where the porch was, and this is looking down the porch where he gave his talks. There was an old iron bed in there that survived and what was left of it. There was an Edison phonograph. I walked through the house. It wasn't from a book about fascinating homes. It was very livable and very comfortable with stairs going upstairs. This is the back of the kitchen with a refrigerator, and the joists for the cistern had burned down. And this is what's left of it. This is the back of the house and the steps coming down the back. So in the end, all the rubble was pushed out to a berm out to extend the dock out into the deeper water of Caesars Creek. And life went on Caesars Creek. Now, across the way is a bit of history. This is the Cocoloba K Club, founded by Carl Fisher in 1919. Now, he had bulkheaded and filled in Miami Beach, and he'd gone ahead and bought Adams Key in order to have a place and made a club for people to come down. As you remember, the Volstead Act from 1919 to 1933 prevented sales of liquors, but at Adams Key, I don't think it made any difference. So on the left-hand side, that white is a seaplane ramp. It was put in by Gar Wood. I'll talk about that in a minute. In the middle is the caretaker's cottage, of which I was inside many times because the caretaker was Mary Buterse's husband, Howard Buterse. Mary Buterse was a sister of Bibi Rebozo. On the right is the casino, and in the back, which isn't there anymore, or wasn't there anymore, is the big house. And the big house had 5 or 6 or 7 rooms with a huge Adirondack type lodge in the middle with a huge fireplace. And you can see the casino to the left of the dock and the seaplane ramp. So the Cocoloba K Club was founded by Carl Fisher on the right-hand side. The big house was in the back. And the interesting thing is that house burned down shortly after the park took over. And Howard Buterse was a patient of mine, and the Park Service said that they had bad wiring is why it burned down. And Howard said he had just finished rewiring it. It wasn't bad wiring. And then Keith Barnes, who lived in that houseboat, said that all the park guys were sitting outside on old couches smoking dope, and they fell asleep, and that's what burned the place down about 1974, 75. So Howard Buterse was Mary Rebozo's husband. Carl Fisher sold this in 1933 to Gar Wood, of speedboat fame, and Gar Wood in turn sold it in the early 50s to Bibi Rebozo. You could see him at the top. On the left is Frank Smathers, the far right is Stuart Symington, and the LBJ is sitting there. And these are the gentlemen that Lancelot Jones and Arthur Jones would fish. And Lancelot would tell me he had Herbert Hoover in the front of his boat once asking him about the Depression and everything. And it was just a very cute, delightful place to be. I have a lot of the registers of this, and you can see the people were there. Jack Dempsey, I can't think of his name. Kettering, who invented the electric starter at Sloan Kettering Institute, he used to come down. Harvey Firestone. There's a huge number of people came down. So life went on. The foundation was cleared. Lancelot continued to harvest his sponges. A lot of notable people that were friends of mine, that are some of which are still around, and he would talk about it. Unfortunately, the park has allowed this to be overgrown. It's a sad thing because this is history. That sloped area there is where the stairs went up to the second story. So across the way was the Cocoloba K Club, and life kind of went on Caesars Creek. Joe Fitzgerald, he's a retired urologist, was a founder of the Miami Map Fair. He used to come down with me. And then Fraser Knight, who just passed away about 2 months ago, was the architect of the house that we built on Elliott Key. And I'll tell you about that in a little bit. So a lot of things were going on Biscayne Bay. This is a Key Biscayne to Key Largo proposal for a causeway by the Dade County Planning Board in 1950. Things were starting to happen with Miami Beach being successful and Key Biscayne being bulkheaded and successful. The next step was to go to the islands to the south. And of course, D.K. Ludwig of the Dade refinery wanted to build an oil refinery where Turkey Point is now. That was in the early 60s. He was going to dig out Caesars Creek and dig out Sands Cut and bring in oil tankers to refine oil. Well, you know where that went. One spill in Biscayne Bay would be history. Fortunately, Hardy Matheson and Dante Fussell and a lot of other people labored long and hard to preserve it, and it became a monument in 1968 and finally a park in 1972. My mother wasn't that happy about it, but she was one of the few people that just wanted to enjoy a lifestyle. Her father sold real estate with Carl Fisher and bought land on Elliott Key, and that's how we owned the land. So this is the north end of Elliott Key. This is Sands Cut. This clearing on the north end was a settlement of sorts. Henry Filer, who was a postmaster of Buena Vista, owned it. Ralph Fossey, a mayor of Miami, owned it for a period of time. And then T.V. Moore, who built all the furniture for most of the homes in Miami back in the 30s and the 40s, he owned it also. There's a couple who lived there, and I would like you to write the book down. It's called Charlotte's Story by Charlotte Needhawk. And Charlotte, basically, he and Russell lived there from 1934 to 36 through the 35 hurricane. And she wrote a very interesting book about living on Elliott Key for a couple of years in that period of time. If you go a little further down where that point is, there's a clearing, and that's where Virginia Tannehill had built a house. And that house was built from the wreckage of the schooner Mandalay that went ashore New Year's Eve of 1966. And they basically had built this house. I was in it many times. It was on the ocean side, about a mile south of Sands Cut. This ramshackle dock went out. They had a clear area in the dock where you could see an undersea garden with anchors and cannons and lots of fish. And all this was a delightful place, all to be taken out by Hurricane Andrew in 1992. Hall Tannehill was a mechanic with Eastern. Virginia lived for a lot longer after this, and they found even 256 pieces of 8 along the beach one day. I happened to own one of them, and she never sold them. She just gave them away. An absolutely delightful person. So this is the southern tip of Elliott Key. And to the left there's a little settlement there. That's Ledbury Lodge, owned by Charlie Brookfield. And Charlie Brookfield was one of the people that recovered 40 or 50 cannons. It was written up in National Geographic in 1940 from the HMS Winchester that went aground in 1698. And 2 of those cannon are in front of the Biscayne Bay Yacht Club. There's one at Ransom School, and I think some were melted down. I'm not sure where they went. In the distance, you could see Caesars Creek, and you could see Adams Key to the right. And then we go on, and life still went on Elliott Key, and and the birds still were flying, and the fish were still biting, and the people started discovering Caesars Creek again. This is looking north. This is Jones Lagoon. It's now a combustion-free zone. You have to go through by the kayak. The Caesars Creek is up at the top, and the southern end of Elliott Key you can barely see. On the left is Totten Key, which Budge sold to Israel Lafayette Jones, and they grew key limes. I have a bunch of key limes left over from the seeds of those key limes. I'm still growing today if anybody wants one. So my mother, in her own inimitable wisdom, wanted to build a house in 1962, and she did. And this is the building, this is permit 1A. I think it was the only one for the city of Islandia building permit. And she believed in the place. The architect was Fraser Knight, who was in practice with Gordon Severett, another architect here in town. And she named it Sandwich Harbor. And that's how the long-term nature of Sandwich Harbor comes from Sandwich Gulf. And the Park Service, to her credit, named Sandwich Bight the little inlet just north of where our property was, and that's on the current maps, which I'm kind of proud to say. So the house was sort of a modular construction, bungalow type. It was up on stilts. We had a 4,000-gallon freshwater cistern, a walk-up crow's nest type of thing, and we were going to add other parts to it. They had a 5 kW generator, and as a kid and a teenager, I used to come down and have a wonderful time with several other friends, and we would fish at night in Caesars Creek, and I didn't realize how lucky I was. It was an amazing place. This is an aerial view of the same, shows you the house, the section lines went all the way through. Spite Highway was on the right-hand side, about 1967 or 68, and we'd walk all the way through to the ocean and back, and it was just a delightful place for kids to roam around. There was some leftover pineapple harvesting implements in the woods there. One of them was a pair of deep flange railroad wheels for wooden ties, two of which are at Adams Key right now. So Sandwich Harbor, this is the sign that it was the end of the dock off of our house. That bump in the dock was from Hurricane Betsy in 1965, but all this was taken over by the park, and it was vandalized pretty seriously. The park stewardship was poor, as we know, and eventually they took down the whole building. The only thing left are the footers, so there's nothing left except one lone palm tree that I'm aware of. So this is a picture of it with a 4,000-gallon freshwater cistern. The 5 kW generator was in a CBS block elevation underneath the house. And my mother wanted to put together an Islandia library, of which I have all the books still, memory of her father and my brother, who died when he was 12. So we come to the end. Lancelot Garfield Jones died on the end of October, the first part of November. He was had left. The Park Service picked him up in 1992, just before Andrew, and he lived there for about another 4 or 5 years. I went up to visit him quite a bit, and I think getting off the island slowed him down quite a bit. He was offered several times to go back to Elliott Key, and he said there's nothing left there anymore at Caesars Creek. So he passed away, and the Monroes and the Mathesons and me and a bunch of other people went to the funeral up on Northwest 50th or Northwest 62nd. Interesting, it's the Poitier Funeral Home. I know the Poitiers. Jeff Poitier is a good friend of mine. His uncle was Sydney. But anyway, Lancelot needs to be remembered, which is the reason I give this talk, as a pioneer, as a frontier person. People started going on about how he made his way in a white world, and that's a lot of garbage. He worked together hand in hand with a lot of people. To the park's credit, they have designated October 12th Lancelot Jones Day, and that has been celebrated for the last 2 or 3 years. It's been kept quiet, but I think we need to honor him for who he was, a really delightful individual. Now, this plaque was put together by many, many friends of his and is attached to the masonry on Porgy Key. It's kind of gotten worn the last time I saw it. I hope it's still there. But I'm going to read it. It says, Porgy Key was purchased by Israel Lafayette Parson Jones, July 7th, 1897, and continuously occupied by the Jones family from 1902 until August 23rd, 1992. Foundation represents the remains of the 2-story, 4-bedroom house built in 1912 and destroyed by fire in 1982. The Jones family farmed pineapples on Porgy Key and on nearby Totten Key, which was purchased in 1916. They also owned property on Old Rhodes Key. Over 250 acres were owned by the family. Pineapples were taken by boat to Key West for sale. After the hurricane of 1906 destroyed the pineapples, the family became one of the largest key lime producers in Florida prior to World War II. The family was completely self-sufficient. Rain provided the necessary fresh water and was stored in the cistern under the kitchen. What food and materials the sea did not provide were brought by boat from the mainland. Israel came from Raleigh, North Carolina in the 1890s and worked on Key Biscayne before moving to Porgy Key. He died September 29, 1932. In his late 70s, his wife, Moselle Albury Jones, came from Harbor Island and was head cook at the Peacock Inn in Coconut Grove before moving to Porgy Key. She died circa 1925 in her 50s. Two sons, Arthur, born 1897, and Lancelot, born in Key Biscayne, October 2, 1898, became fishing guides after World War II. They guided numerous visitors to South Florida, including Herbert Hoover, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon. Arthur died February 22, 1966. He served in the Navy, World War I, and the Army in World War II. Lancelot continued to live alone on the island until forced to leave at the age of 94 by Hurricane Andrew in 1992. For the second time, his home, then located to the east of the foundation, was totally destroyed. Lancelot was well known to area boaters as the philosopher of Porgy Key. He would welcome all who stopped at his dock with his sponge lectures, his recollections of local history, and comments on current events. And after formation of Biscayne National Park, he continued to share his knowledge of school children at the Environmental Education Center located on Adams Key. When the Joneses, a Black family, bought Porgy Key, Dade County had fewer than 5,000 residents. When they left there, it was almost 2 million. And this is put together by friends of the Jones family. And so I just feel very honored to be able to discuss this gentleman and his history. And I appreciate your time and thank you very much.
Very nice, very nice. So he lived to be, what, 99?
99 years old. I always say he kind of went through the 19th to the 20th, almost to the 21st century.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that is really amazing. And such local history. And yet, I think
that's
it's so unknown to most people, right?
That's just the beginning. I ought to put this on YouTube or something. I don't know if I'll publish a book, but there's bits and pieces of this, but to gather it all together is really, it's a really remarkable what happened here.
Beautiful
30
story.
people.
Thank you, Dr. Nordt.
Oh, you're welcome.
Dr. Nordt, I got a question for you.
Yes, sir.
You own property, or your family owned property on Elliott Key. Do you know anything about something called Camp Recovery? It was run by a gentleman named Andy Matthew. It was an alcoholic recovery center.
Yes, became the Camp Recovery is where the park has its station right now in the middle part. Camp Recovery was, and it was taken over. Either it was a Jim Dooley fishing camp before or after, I can't remember, but that did exist. And right in the middle of where the federal government now has their station now. And it existed. I could dig up some information about it if you want to know, but that's exactly where it was. There were several homes. There was, you go south, Wade Stiles was there, Charlie Brookfield. You go north, I mentioned the Filer family, all the Sweeting family. It's amazing what was going on. It wasn't a pristine place. Bill Whitman grew citrus, who started also Bal Harbor Shops. He was a great citrus. He has a area in his memory at Fairchild now, but he grew a lot of tropical fruits on Elliott Key. Also, the Pancoast family was very involved. So I know it's more information than you need, but I apologize.
Well, no, I appreciate that, because the reason I ask is because my brother and I went there when we were teenagers, probably about 1965 or so, something like that. And I remember, Captain, they call him Captain Andy. He had a boat at Bayfront Park, and we got on the boat, little launch, jumped over to the dock there, and then got in. He had maybe an early 1950s, mid 1950s pickup truck.
Yep.
And jolted his way up to that house, and it was, it sat right on the ocean, and it was up on, it sat up high.
Yeah.
And it had a garage with a cistern underneath it, and there was a giant yellow rat snake that lived on the top of that cistern. And we just kids, we just wandered around, and I started my bottle collecting career there, and I just have fond memories of it. But of course, this was in the summertime, and the mosquitoes were really, really bad.
Yeah,
But
they kept you moving.
yeah.
When they all
you know what? I knew Lancelot Jones. He was a good friend to my god sister, and he used to stay out here in the Brownsville area a lot. And when I would go to see her, I would meet him there. And so I want to thank you for educating us about him, because I think it's too little known about him. And he was such an unassuming person that you wouldn't have known anything about him anyway, you know, because I would just see him sitting there, and he wasn't, you know, much. He didn't talk much, but I got to know who he was. And,
What is your name?
My name is Enid. My name is Enid Pickney.
Edith Pickney. Did you know Mercilessly Adderley?
That's his goddaughter.
Yeah, I know. I knew her. She passed away about 4 or 5 years ago.
And she passed away. She and I went to Talladega College.
Oh.
We both
No, I knew her very well, and she had a good friend. They both taught languages at Dade County schools.
Right, that's right. She majored in foreign language.
That's
at
right.
Talladega. Yes, yes.
Well, I am tickled to death that you spoke up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and Andrea is her sister, and the whole family. You know, my mother and her grandmother were good friends, and we grew up, you know, in the same church. So I really appreciate, and I want to say this too, because I called someone who was doing a documentary on Black history while you were talking there, because I wanted them to get in on this, but they're doing something, but they would like to get with you to, because they couldn't get on right now. They'd like to get with you to get some of this information.
And Enid, you know that we're recording the presentation.
Okay,
So-
well, maybe, and I'll tell her that, Bob, I'll tell her to get in touch with somebody.
Yeah.
Get
We'll
this
put a-
information.
Call me.
Put a
I'm
link
happy
on the
to.
website so you can reach it, and I'll send you a link.
Okay, because this needs to be a part of that documentary.
I
Yeah.
agree. I agree with you. Call me anytime. I'd give the talk to a bunch of you if you want. Happy to do it.
Okay.
Now,
And
there's
this
a few-
is thrilling, just, you know, I almost missed the meeting because I forgot. And then I came to the computer to do something else. And then I said, oh, this is the meeting. And I turned on and here you are. And then I look up and I said, oh my God, it's Lancelot Jones. somebody that I know. I knew, I didn't know him.
Edith, I have a 40-minute video, an interview with him 30 years ago. You'd love to see the whole thing someday.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's exciting to me.
Well, Enid, I'm glad you remembered. And what a world we live in now, where you have to go to Zoom meetings, right? Nobody forces anybody, but now we go to Zoom meetings. But I think things like this, I mean, something as simple as some photographs and maps and a talk can just be so fascinating, can it?
Yeah.
And you just hope that this stuff never gets lost, right?
We'll take it off here.
There's so much more out there. Now, some of the questions people ask, John, in the chat section were, why did they call it the Housekeepers Club?
I know, but there was a way you could just.
Well, it was originally called the Pine Needle Club, and they changed it to the Housekeepers Club because I think they wanted to, all the wives wanted to come in, and that all I know is that Ralph Monroe put it together, and the Pine Needles Club was more of a knitting sewing society, and they wanted to do more for the community, and I think that was a front for power at that time.
I think also it was established before the General Federation of Women's Club existed.
Correct.
Which they then joined later on.
Correct.
Yeah, clearly women needed, you know, some collaboration in a pioneer environment, you know.
And we're just starting to appreciate how great they are.
Yeah. There's a long list of wonderful stuff. I mean, Royal Palm Park. I mean, it just goes on forever, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Let's see. Somebody asked, did Parson Jones have glass windows?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Because the problem was mosquitoes. Okay, when we had the house on Elliott Key, we had glass jalousies and redwood jalousies, and at night we'd keep the windows open, no air conditioning, but the sandflies were killer. So we kept the generator going, and we made the fan work. And if you painted the screens with kerosene, the sandflies wouldn't bother you. And that was an old trick from the Keys, and I think that's what they did there too, I suppose.
I remember an old story when I was a kid that the Trinity Church, when it started, They didn't have windows, and
I
they
filled
used
it up in a
cheesecloth,
pump.
and people called it the Church of the Holy Cheesecloth.
Florida.
So, you
I'm
know,
sorry, I couldn't hear that because there's like somebody unmuted. Or
oh,
could you-
okay. So the first Episcopal church in Miami was the Trinity Church, and our family was one of the first members in. And they didn't have the money for glass windows, so they used cheesecloth to try to keep the mosquitoes and bugs out. And the nickname of it was the Church of the Holy Cheesecloth. So
That's awesome.
that was the joke, you know.
Thanks.
Yeah. So more questions. Anybody got a question?
Go.
There was a question here about pineapple, and that was a major crop at one point, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And the 1906 hurricane kind of salted the land.
Ah,
And something else happened shortly after that. Flagler completed his railroad in 1912
and Cuba.
to Key West. And so they could bring pineapples to New York in 2 or 3 days
Yeah.
rather than 3 weeks. And so that ended the pineapple culture and the agricultural part. And then I mentioned the 3 parts: wrecking, agricultural, then developers, which
Yeah.
is what it was. And then you went to the park.
I know that also once the railroad was in Key West, it was easy to bring Cuban fruit up, and that really had a big effect on South Florida agriculture in terms of the tropicals, you know.
That's true. That's true.
Somebody said, did Frank Smathers, was he a banker on Miami Beach?
Well, he was a senator,
Yeah.
and I don't know what his history was with the Smathers family. He was a senator for the state.
Yeah.
Federal, and he lived in a house off of Cutler Road.
Yeah. The 3, was it 5 sisters, 5 fillies?
Yeah, and actually I operated on his wife, I think, and put a new hip in her.
It's a
Nice
beautiful
guy.
property right across from the Montgomery estate. An incredible
Exactly
property.
right.
Owned by University of Miami now.
Yeah, it's where the
They
president.
donated it to him.
And somebody asked, Frank asked, where did Lancelot get his college education?
It was I forget the name of the college. It was in St. Augustine, and I have to dig it up.
Oh, yeah, I know that.
Bethune?
Bethune-Cookman.
It might be. That's in St. Augustine. Yes.
Yeah, that's in St. Augustine.
Florida Memorial, probably.
And that may be Florida Memorial. I think you're
Yeah,
right.
Florida
That's in-
Memorial. It was Florida Memorial was in St. Augustine before they moved it to Miami.
Yeah, I think that makes more sense to me. That rings a bell. I didn't check on those details. So, Becky, how are you?
Good to see you. I so enjoyed this. I wanted to ask you, is there any connection, and there probably is, between Lancelot Jones and the Deerings and the Deering estate property? We're trying to come up with more of the actual history of the property, including a lot, of course, the Bahamian connections. And I just thought this was so right on target for what I've been looking at. And so I'm so thrilled you have all this information.
Well, I
That
just
your
the tip of the
presentation
iceberg.
would be a wonderful thing for us to have.
Let's get together. We'll talk about it. I don't know of a lot of connections with Charles Deering, split off from James Deering. He was up, where was it? He had the island up north of Lemon City, and then he moved down here and he built a house and everything. But I don't know how much of a connection he had with the Jones family. They would go up the west side of the bay to Miami River and they'd sell their produce and everything. But I never heard too much about them stopping anywhere, except maybe to visit Commodore Ralph Monroe, but that's all. But that was a
Well,
while.
I mean, I was thinking even later, in the 20s or 30s, even the heirs, when they still owned the Deering estate. I know the Biscayne Bay Yacht Club, I think, had several Washington birthday regatta things or chowder parties there. But I just didn't know if since that part of the bay would be close by boat.
Let me say something about Lancelot. It's a very funny situation. He was a very very private person. We always had talks at Biscayne Bay once a month, and I asked him several times, very 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 politely, to ask if he would come up to dinner and maybe talk a little bit. And at that time, there wasn't any race issues in Miami when he grew up. But I think he was terribly respectful, and he always declined because he said, well, my calendar's a little full right now and I can't go. And I think he would have been revered and appreciated more than he knew. And I wasn't going to sway him one way or the other, but we discussed that once or twice. But he lived in his own world. And even though the Park Service said that he survived in a white world, he was a frontier person, just like Monroe and everybody else was. And they all worked together. There wasn't a lot of racism when he was there. And I have to say that. I don't know if, Edith, you believe that or not. I've talked to many people who agreed the same thing. I think it came on a lot later, if at all. So,
Rob, could
Yeah.
you unshare?
what?
Stop sharing.
Yeah, we're not sharing his screen anymore.
Yeah, but if you stop sharing, then we become bigger, our screen.
Then
still
we can see everybody.
Yeah.
Oh, can you go to the view called Gallery View?
Yeah, I have it on, but you
Oh, you
still
have
see a
that.
screen. It says the end.
Yes, it does.
Oh,
Ian.
all right. Let me can it. I see what you're saying because that takes
Then
over
we
the
can see
screen,
more
right?
faces.
Takes over.
Is that better?
Still there.
It's still there. Okay. All right. View options.
I'm trying to figure out how to get,
No.
I'm not very good at this. I'm sorry.
Becky,
Yes.
okay, my father used to work for Mr. Deering.
No, how wonderful. I didn't know that, Edith. My gosh. Holy cow.
I got rid of it there, but I don't know.
Of all people that I know so well,
Rob.
and I didn't even know that.
Rob, go to the screen share on the bottom
Yeah, I did it.
and say stop sharing.
Yeah, and I hit stop sharing.
You want me to do screen share?
Yeah, if you stop your screen sharing, maybe that'll do it. Here we
Oh,
are.
yeah.
Right?
Share right there.
All right.
Yay.
Now you get it.
Hi. Okay, now we're back.
Now we see everybody.
Thank you for that.
Thanks for the
Okay.
heads up.
So one thing, Becky, the public dock at Deering, at Cutler was one of the few places where the public could access the bay. And it might have made sense that people coming over from, Key Biscayne, well, not Key Biscayne, but from Elliott Key would have come to the Deering estate as the closest dock. It makes some sense, or Homestead, but
Well, that was Cutler, and that was a place to go south.
yeah. So there may be something to that.
Well, I want to talk to Enid more too later, one-on-one about your father working for Charles Deering. I mean, that is,
There you go.
I had no idea. So
Yeah,
I'm sure
well, my father was from the Bahamas and he was a farmer and he used to dive for sponges. He was a sponger also. And, but,
All around guy.
and there was a song, Sponger Money Never Dies. And, but when he came here, he had no land to farm, so he went into gardening. And he worked, and he met Mr. Deering. Unbeknown to him, he didn't know who the man was, but I'll tell you about that story when we talk.
Oh, okay.
Another
Oh,
great
that's
one.
great.
Becky, include me on that. I'd show up.
Okay, well, I this is exciting. That's why I love people who love history and preservation, because there are always so many wonderful stories to share, and one thing leads to another. It's just
And one thing you touched on a little bit was that causeway, which again in the eyes of developers was just a wonderful idea, but would have irrevocably changed.
I have maps of Elliott Key that show the bulkhead lines that were proposed, which would have doubled the size of the island.
Yeah.
And it would have destroyed the shoreline as we know it today. And thank God it didn't happen.
So like Key Biscayne, they would have filled in tremendous, and Miami Beach, they would have filled in tremendously on the bay side.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a win for environmentalism, wasn't it? One of the early ones.
Oh, absolutely.
And like the jet port in the Everglades was an early environmental win. So wonderful. Any more questions? Frank, you got a question?
Well, I have several. They're small. For instance, there was a house in that map you showed of Coconut Grove that had a Mr. Rhodes house, and you skipped over him. Do you know anything about him?
I'm aware of the house. I can't tell you much else about it. He was one of the early pioneers. He's one of the early pioneers of Coconut Grove, and I could probably dig up some information, but not offhand.
Do you know his first name? I couldn't catch it off the map.
Let me see if I can find it. Hold on. One of the things while I'm looking is very interesting is there was the school was up there on Grand Avenue, and that schoolhouse is now at Plymouth Church, the original schoolhouse.
Right.
There are a number of roads in Homestead, and I didn't know whether they were related to this guy or not.
I don't know. I think it was RHODES.
Yeah.
Yep.
I wrote it down off your map. That's the way it was on the map. And that's the way they spell it in Homestead.
I'm trying to find it on the map. I've got the original map here, but
they're mainly farmers.
yes.
There was a question about whether Lancelot ever lived on Soldier Key. Were there any settlements on Soldier Key?
There were two of them. One was a bunch of buildings to use as a jumping off place to build Fowey Light in 1876.
Okay, so they landed there and had
Yeah, and that was their base of operations, and they put screw piles into the reef. And then about hurricanes wiped that out in 1906, and then George Merrick built some places there that they came out by boat and seaplane to utilize in the 1920s and the 30s. And then the last several hurricanes have kind of wiped it out. There's some seawalls there, but nothing else.
And any idea of the naming of Soldier Key?
That escapes me totally. I don't know. Unless
trivia question.
It's very interesting story. I can't tell you that. It's either you go to the Spanish American, you go to the Seminole Wars. You can go also to World War I. I don't know. I'll have to look into that.
Anybody have an idea, Jeff? Do you know?
Yeah, there was. I don't know about the naming of it, but there was a club, like John says, there was a club on that key early on, and about 1905, 1906, and we have a photograph of. I can't think of the guy's name. The man that sailed around the world.
Slocum?
Yeah, Slocum. We got a photograph of his boat docked at Soldier Key.
His boat's name was Spray.
Right. And we got a picture of that boat docked at Soldier Key. It was
somewhere in, I think around the 1890s, 98 to 1901, somewhere in that neighborhood. I have a picture of my grandmother and grandfather that took a boat to Soldier Key. It was labeled on the back of the, a shot, a personal photograph. That it's Soldier.
The boat that came out from the Royal Palm was the Louise. That was the one that brought people out from the Royal Palm Hotel in Miami.
So they would do day trips out to there and have a picnic or something, huh?
Yeah.
Well, it was a place, it was a watering hole for all the wealthy people.
Well, my grandfather worked for Frank Budge, and he was quite a sportsman and had an early motorboat around that time. And I believe that's how they got to Soldier Key.
And of course, during Prohibition, there would have been a lot going on at Stiltsville.
That's my
anywhere where you could see them coming, not to mention the hotels in Miami Beach. It was sort of Prohibition light here in many ways. I think the issue was to keep working people from getting drunk on Monday morning and going.
I have to interrupt with a question. I have a question about there was a club. I'm Gloriana, a friend of John's. There was a club in Stiltsville. I know my parents used to go.
Yeah.
And I know that they sold liquor or something and they weren't taxed or something, but my dad always used to go out there. What was the name of that?
The Quarterdeck Club.
The Quarterdeck and the Bikini Club, I think, were
right.
women's.
That's right.
There was a sign on the front that said, what was it? I'm going to ruin it. It was like, no bathing, no pants allowed. I don't know, something. What was the famous sign? I don't know.
There's a picture of that in the Stiltsville Restaurant
Yeah.
that's on Miami Beach now.
Yeah.
That's why I asked.
You got to go to the Stiltsville Restaurant on Miami Beach. There's a lot of old pictures there. It's right on across the Venetian Causeway. It's just on the left as you go across to the beach.
What a great theme for a restaurant, huh?
Yes.
Yeah, I never even heard
We
of
have a picture of that club there.
Yeah.
It was kind of infamous out there. There was the ship or the barge that went aground and became a meeting place.
Right.
Stiltsville in itself really lends to so many wonderful stories because it was always flirting on either side of legitimacy, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, that's the way Miami's always been.
Or debauchery.
And goodness knows what happened in those cabins in the Everglades. No, don't ask. All right. So, but that's South Florida. Look, the further you get away, the more crazy it gets. How about out in Everglades City? They would just take you out if they didn't like you. I mean, it was kind of wild, right? I see Connie and Tim are with us today. Did you enjoy the presentation?
Yes, I have to tell you, we lived in the Bahamas for 7 years, and we're just hungry for history of the links between the Bahamas and South Florida. And they are so rich, and I've learned so much new today. And I'm delighted to see and hear at Pinckney. I used to be the editor of a publication for the Bahamian diaspora in South Florida called Junkanoo. Remember Godfrey Young and Junkanoo, Enid?
Yes, you featured me in there one time.
That story.
But you're right, Connie. It does remind us, if you've been to the out islands of the Bahamas where life is rather simple, it sort of evoked that. Don't you think, John, that, simple
Yep.
life, sistrunks and living off the land and a peaceful existence. With mosquitoes.
Let me tell her this, that there's a young man, he's Italian, and he's in Italy right now, but he's done photographic books on the Bahamas. He's done Eleuthera and some of the other islands. And
are you speaking of the Popoff brothers?
No. His name is Sano Alessandro.
Okay.
And he has done another book on Exuma, where my mother was from.
Nice.
And he's featuring, there's a page in there where he's featuring me with the doll. I don't know how many of you saw the article that Calvin Hughes did on the doll that my mother gave to.
Oh, yes, I saw that.
Almond, you remember? She was their maid. My mother was her parents' maid. And she gave Barbara a doll when Barbara was a little girl. And Barbara kept the doll for 60 years. And then started looking for me. She didn't know where I was. And she asked Calvin Hughes, and Calvin knew me. And so they did this story on this doll, and it's how my mother gave it to her and she saved it all because it meant so much to her, because my mother was so warm and friendly, and she always cherished my mother's love. And so he had me to take the doll, and with the doll and a picture of me will be in the book that's coming out. And I understand that they're going to have an exhibit of his photos of Exuma, the island of Exuma. And there's supposed to be an exhibit at the Betsy Hotel sometime in December.
Well, that is an amazing story, Enid. That is an amazing story. I was really overwhelmed when I read that story, and I thought it was just so great that you two got back together and shared a mother in a way, right?
Right, right.
And the doll was an incredible reminder.
Yeah. She said that Calvin Hughes emceed a banquet or something that she attended, and they're downsizing and they're going to move, and she wanted to get that doll back to me. And she said she told her husband, I wonder if she knew my mother had 2 children, and she wondered if he knew them. And she was going to ask him if he knew me. And she said, her husband said, oh, no, don't ask him that, because he'll think that you think he knows all the Black people in Miami. But she said that it just laid on her heart so heavy that she didn't listen to her husband. And she asked Calvin anyhow. So I told her that was my mother's spirit.
Wonderful, wonderful story.
That is indeed.
Well, we really have had a wonderful gathering today, haven't we?
I can't wait.
I mean, we're so lucky to have people who want to present like John, who have a real, skin in the game of local history. And this is really just so wonderful. There's not enough of this.
It's just a passion is what it is. It's got to be kept alive.
Yeah, yeah. Well, John, we all thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And maybe we could look forward to another topic in the future with you.
Well, I'll talk to you. I have something else that we might be able to talk about. Might be interesting also. So
that's wonderful. And a reminder, Becky is going to come to us with the ladies of Deering and make a presentation, which we missed at the height of COVID madness, because they did their wonderful flight. Is it Flight Out of Egypt?
Flight into Egypt.
Flight
the
into
restoration
Egypt.
of these medieval stained glass.
Stained glass restoration was a wonderful story. And I think we're going to get a great crowd for that. And once again, we're looking forward to that, Becky. Thank you so much.
Well,
and I think we've settled on a date in May. We'll have to just confirm that up. But we like to plan ahead, right? So thanks everybody.
Yeah. Can I ask something I would personally would love to hear about? I don't know if you have planned or if John could tell me more. Or I'm working with the Junior League. We're doing a new movie. I'm going to write the script on Miami, founded by a woman and making magic ever since.
Right.
And the first episode is going to be on Julia Tuttle, but really telling a lot more than just the simple little legend everybody knows about her. And I am just in my mind trying to find as much of the visuals that would depict Miami, many of which, John, you mentioned the 1880s, 70s, 90s. And I just would love to see like a picture of Julia Tuttle's house on the river just when, like 1898, when she died. Is there anything that any of you know where there's a picture of that?
I think that could be retrievable. I would love to be involved. You know Marty Grafton?
Of course, yes.
Marty wrote the book about the most important women in Miami and all that.
Yes, I have that book, both editions, the later, but I got honored as one of those later ladies, as certainly Enid was too.
My great grandmother's in that book.
Oh, and your great grandmother was who?
She's in the book, and she wrote the first book published in Miami, supposedly.
And her name was?
Sarah Jane Brock, B-R-O-C-K.
Oh, great. I'll look it up.
And that was my great grandmother. It's my mother's grandmother. And
what a distinction.
Yeah.
First book.
And she's still with us in the Miami City Cemetery.
Oh.
Yeah, Enid, we know about the Miami City Cemetery.
You know what? Let me tell you now. Yeah, I got a battle with this. With the city now, I'm also working with the Lemon City Cemetery.
Yeah.
Because they're supposed, we have a historical marker for the Lemon City Cemetery, but we were supposed to also get 3 historical markers for the 3 Black communities in Lemon City, and they're messing around with that. So I'm getting kind of frustrated.
Is that at the state level, Enid?
No, well, yeah, they already have it. The problem is the person who's supposed to get the permit to put it up is too busy to do it, and this is ridiculous.
That's a bad sign.
Be very careful.
Huh?
Be very careful
Be very careful.
with those people.
Oh my God, they're frustrating.
Edith, I can't express how much it is. You made my day meeting you on this, because Sarah Wood I knew personally, and her father worked for Allison, and and then Merciley was her daughter, and I knew all of them very well, and I just find it amazing. I got to connect with you one of these days soon. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
This is when we thought that everybody knew Enid.
Yeah, everybody. Well, she.
We
When
found
she
someone
was
who didn't
president
know
of Dade
Enid yet.
Heritage Trust, we were all over everywhere. And then I to brag about Enid some more, she just had her 89th birthday celebrated from the historic Hampton House, which she helped save, and led the effort to save.
Use this, the more
And
batteries you
that was
adjust,
just
you
what,
can
a
plug it.
week or two ago. We had a Zoom celebration, so her footprint is all over this community. So.
Say that.
Becky, thank you for your lovely remarks that you said during my birthday. Thank you on the Zoom.
Well deserved.
Broadcast.
Well deserved.
The legend. Well, listen, I'm gonna stop the recording now, and we're gonna take a break, and we'll send out a link to everybody who's on our email list, so they can watch this later or give it to a friend if they didn't get to see it.
Great. That's wonderful.
So this is going to be wonderful. John, we can't thank you enough for such a
thank
wonderful
you.
And I think also, as always, our members and friends love to jump in and tell a story and keep things going and add a little something. And so thank you everybody for participating. That really was, I think, a wonderful thing. We look forward to telling you what we're going to do for December, the first Sunday in December. And we look forward to seeing you then. So ta-ta. Before we go, let me get a picture of everybody waving, okay?
Oh, let me get a picture.
All right, I'm gonna set up a screen capture here, and I'm gonna tell you. Okay, do your wave, Here we go. Hey, okay, how corny is that, huh? All
Love
right.
it.
Thank you.
I've got evidence now.
Thank you.
See?
That's
All right,
great.
goodbye, everybody. We love you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.